I thought I understood what it meant to keep someone at a distance. Not the obvious kind of distance. Not silence. Not avoidance. Not the deliberate absence. People notice and eventually question. I mean the quieter kind. The kind where someone can be close to you without ever reaching the part of you that actually matters. I became good at that. Maybe too good. I learned how to speak without revealing too much. How to answer honestly while still leaving the most important part untouched. How to let someone believe they understood me without ever giving them enough access to prove whether they actually did. It wasn't deception. At least, that's what I told myself. It was control. There are parts of a person that become difficult to protect once they're placed in someone else's hands. Things that can be misunderstood. Things that can be interpreted incorrectly. Things that sound different when someone else gives them a name. So I kept those parts unnamed, unexplained, untouched. People could know me without knowing what moved underneath everything I showed them, and that arrangement worked. It worked for years, until you appeared. I don't remember the exact moment. The difference began. That's what bothers me. There was no obvious beginning. No conversation I can point to and say, there, that's where everything changed. No dramatic confession, no moment where the world seemed to stop and announce that something important happened. It was smaller than that, almost invisible. A detail here, a reaction there, a pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have, a sentence that somehow landed deeper than the words themselves. And then, slowly, I started noticing something I couldn't explain. You were paying attention differently, not more intensely, differently. Most people listen for information. They want the story, the explanation, the reason. They collect details so they can build an image of you that makes sense to them. You didn't seem interested in building an image. You seemed interested in what was underneath the image. And that distinction changed everything. Because when someone tries to understand you, you can control what they receive. You can choose your words. You can redirect. You can leave things unsaid. You can give them one version of the truth and keep the rest somewhere they can't reach. But when someone notices what you don't say, the usual defenses become less useful. You can't edit silence. You can't rearrange a pause. You can't easily hide the meaning behind the way you stop yourself from saying something. And somehow, you notice those things, not loudly. You never made a performance out of understanding me. You didn't announce what you saw. You didn't turn every small observation into some dramatic statement about how deeply you knew me. You simply noticed, and then you remembered. That was what made it different, because being noticed can be uncomfortable. Being remembered is something else entirely. You remembered the things I thought would disappear into the conversation. You remembered the small changes, the difference between when I was genuinely quiet and when I was simply done speaking, the difference between a short answer that meant nothing and a short answer that meant too much. You noticed when my words were precise because I wanted to explain something, and when they were precise because I didn't want to explain anything at all. I never told you how unusual that was. Maybe I should have, but saying it would have made it real. And I wasn't ready for that. There are certain things you can feel long before you're willing to admit them. This was one of them. I knew something had shifted before I knew what the shift meant. I knew because I started anticipating you, not waiting for you. Anticipating you, there is a difference. Waiting is conscious. You know you're waiting. Anticipation can happen underneath awareness. You read something and already know how the other person might respond. You experience something and instinctively imagine what they would notice. You hear a sentence and think they would understand why that matters. You begin carrying another perspective inside your own without realizing when you invited it in. That's what happened. You became part of the way I processed things. And I didn't choose that. That might be the strangest part. I have always been careful about who gets access to my internal world. I don't hand it over casually. I don't even hand it over because someone asks. If anything, asking usually makes me retreat, because the moment someone demands access, I become aware of the boundary. And once I'm aware of the boundary, I protect it. You never demanded anything. You didn't ask me to open up. You didn't insist that I explain myself. You didn't try to force closeness into existence. You gave me space, and somehow that space became the reason I stopped needing so much of it. That's difficult to explain, because people assume closeness comes from constant presence. Sometimes it does, but sometimes closeness comes from the absence of pressure, from knowing that you don't have to perform, that you don't have to make yourself understandable every second, that you can leave something unfinished, and the other person won't immediately replace the missing pieces with assumptions. You let things remain unfinished. And because you did, I started finishing them myself, not for you, with you in mind. That's when I realized you had reached somewhere I hadn't intended anyone to reach. You had become part of the room inside my mind where I make sense of things. And that room was never supposed to have visitors. It was private. Not because it was secret, because it was fragile. There is a difference. Secrets are hidden because you don't want people to know them. Fragile things are hidden because you don't want people to mishandle them. I have always been more concerned about the second. People can take something true and make it false simply by interpreting it carelessly. They can take a fear and call it weakness, take silence and call it arrogance, take independence and call it detachment, take intensity and call it instability, take thoughtfulness and call it hesitation. People are constantly translating each other into languages they already understand. You didn't. You seemed willing to encounter what was there without immediately translating it. And that made me feel something I wasn't accustomed to feeling. Not comfort. Something more complicated. Recognition. The strange sensation of not having to explain the architecture before someone understands the shape of the room. You didn't need a map. You noticed the doors, the walls, the places where the light changed, and somehow you didn't treat any of it like something that needed fixing. That mattered, more than I expected, because I think I've spent a lot of my life believing that being understood comes with a cost. You have to explain yourself. You have to become vulnerable. You have to hand someone the instructions to your internal world and trust them not to misuse them. But with you, understanding didn't seem to require an explanation. It arrived through observation, through consistency, through the accumulation of moments that individually meant very little, but collectively became impossible to dismiss. That's how you became familiar. Not through history, through accuracy. And perhaps that's why it feels so strange, because familiarity is supposed to be earned through time, years, shared experiences, mistakes, arguments, reconciliations, long conversations, ordinary days, the slow accumulation of knowing someone. But there was something about this that didn't feel slow. It felt like recognition arriving before biography, like something in the structure of how We perceive the world was already familiar before our stories had enough time to become familiar. I don't know what to call that. And I've stopped trying. Names can be useful, but they can also become cages. The moment you label something, people start expecting it to behave according to the label. Friendship should look like this. Love should look like that. Kikganching should develop this way. Trust should happen in this order. But what happens when something doesn't follow the expected sequence? What happens when recognition comes before history? When understanding comes before explanation? When someone's presence changes you before you have decided what their place in your life is supposed to be? You can't force that into a category without losing something. So I stopped naming it. For a while, that felt safe. If I didn't define it, I didn't have to decide what it meant. If I didn't decide what it meant, I didn't have to acknowledge what it was doing to me. And for some time, that was enough until it wasn't, because undefined things don't remain neutral forever. Eventually, they begin shaping the space around them. You notice yourself making room. You notice yourself protecting the connection. You notice yourself considering another person's perspective before your own decision is complete. You notice how their absence feels different from the absence of everyone else. You notice how a conversation can end, but somehow continue inside your mind, and then you realize the thing you've been refusing to define has already defined something in you. A place, a preference, a new reference point, a new way of measuring what feels real. That's what you became, a reference point, not because I decided to compare everyone to you. It just happened. Someone says something, and I notice whether it has the same honesty. Someone listens, and I notice whether they actually heard what was beneath the words. Someone responds to silence, and I notice whether they become uncomfortable or whether they can simply let it exist. Someone misunderstands something, and I remember that you didn't. It's not fair to anyone else. Maybe it's not even fair to you, because you never asked to become a standard. You never asked to be remembered this way. You never asked to occupy that position in my internal world. But once someone changes the way you perceive something, you can't simply return to the old perception because it's more convenient. That's the problem with genuine impact. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need intention. It doesn't even need permanence to matter. Sometimes one interaction is enough to change what you notice afterward. But this wasn't one interaction. It was repetition, consistency, a pattern. And patterns are difficult to dismiss, especially when they keep appearing where coincidence should have ended. I began noticing how often you seem to arrive at the same place I had been thinking about, how often your words touched something I hadn't explained, how often your silence seemed to occur exactly when silence was what I needed. Maybe none of those things were extraordinary individually. Maybe I could explain each one away. Coincidence, timing, probability, disciple, observation. But eventually, explanations started feeling less convincing than the pattern itself. And I don't trust patterns blindly. I examine them. I look for inconsistencies. I try to find the point where the illusion breaks. I tried that with you. I looked for the moment where the connection would reveal itself as projection. I expected to find it. I wanted to find it, at least partly, because finding the flaw would have made everything easier. If I could prove that I had imagined the depth, I could step back. I could return to normal. I could tell myself that I had mistaken familiarity for compatibility, recognition for connection, intensity for meaning. But the flaw never appeared in the way I expected. Instead, the more I examined it, the more coherent it became. That frightened me. Not because I thought something was wrong, because coherence makes denial difficult. If something is chaotic, you can dismiss it. If something is inconsistent, you can wait for it to disappear. But if something continues to make sense from different angles, you have to confront it. And eventually, I had to confront this. You had become significant without asking to be. That is not something I know how to handle easily. Significance creates responsibility. Not necessarily responsibility toward another person, responsibility toward yourself. Once someone matters, your decisions stop being purely internal. You have to consider what your silence means, what your distance means, what your presence communicates, what you allow to continue, what you choose to stop. And I wasn't used to having that kind of consideration attached to a connection I hadn't consciously chosen. But maybe that's the illusion. Maybe we don't choose every meaningful connection. Maybe sometimes we only choose what we do after realizing it's there. The beginning can be accidental. The continuation is where choice begins. And I think that's where I am now. Not asking how this happened. Not asking why you appeared. Not asking whether I was supposed to meet you. Those questions have become less interesting. The question that matters is simpler. What do I do with something that has already changed me? Because it has. I can pretend otherwise. I can return to old habits. I can create distance. I can become careful again. I can make the boundaries visible. I can tell myself that whatever this is, it will eventually fade. If I stop feeding it attention, maybe it would. But there's a difference between something fading because it was never real and something fading because you deliberately refused to let it continue. I don't know which would be harder. Losing something that wasn't real would be easy. Walking away from something real because you're afraid of what it could become is different. That leaves a particular kind of silence behind. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that keeps asking what would have happened if you had stayed. I don't want to live inside that question. Not forever. I've already spent enough time wondering about things I never allowed myself to discover. So maybe the honest thing isn't to promise anything. Maybe it's simply to stop pretending I don't notice what is happening. I notice you. I notice the effect of your presence. I notice how my thinking changes when you enter the equation. I notice how some things feel easier to articulate because I know you would understand the shape of the thought even if the words aren't perfect. I notice that I don't feel the same need to protect every unfinished thought. I notice that silence doesn't automatically mean distance anymore. Sometimes silence means presence. Sometimes it means there is nothing to repair, nothing to explain, nothing to prove. And I think that's one of the rarest forms of connection. The ability to exist without constantly demonstrating that you belong. Most relationships are filled with maintenance, reassurance, explanations, proof, questions, and whatters. And those things can be beautiful. But there is another kind of closeness that exists beneath all of them. The kind where nothing needs to happen for the connection to remain recognizable. That kind of closeness is difficult to fake because performance requires activity. Silence reveals what remains when activity disappears. And when everything becomes quiet, somehow you are still there, not physically, not necessarily even through words, but as a presence in the way I interpret the quiet. That is what I mean when I say you changed something. You changed the meaning of absence. Before you, absence was absence. Now, sometimes it feels like another form of presence, and I don't know whether that's beautiful or dangerous. Maybe both, because once someone becomes part of the way you experience silence, they are no longer simply someone you interact with. They have become part of your internal landscape. And internal landscapes are difficult to rearrange. You can move furniture, you can close doors, you can stop visiting certain rooms, but you still know where they are. That's what I think happened. You became a room I didn't know existed, and I keep finding myself there, not because I'm trying to escape the world, because something in that room feels honest. There is no performance there, no need to appear composed, no need to have the correct answer, no need to make every thought reasonable. I can simply notice, and maybe that's what you gave me without realizing it, permission to notice myself, not just you, me, because sometimes another person doesn't change us by giving us something new. Sometimes they reveal something that was already inside us, but remained unexamined. You did that. You made me see how much of myself I had organized around control, how much of my distance wasn't simply preference but habit, how often I confused being self-contained with being untouched, how often I assumed that needing no one meant I had achieved some higher form of independence. Maybe it wasn't independence. Maybe it was simply familiarity with solitude. There's nothing wrong with solitude, but solitude becomes limiting when you start believing that everything meaningful must be experienced alone. You challenged that without ever trying to. You didn't ask me to depend on you. You didn't ask me to change my nature. You didn't ask me to become someone who needs constant closeness. You simply existed in a way that made connection feel less like a threat to independence. And that changed something, because perhaps real connection isn't the opposite of independence. Perhaps it is choosing someone while remaining yourself, letting someone matter without surrendering yourself, allowing influence without losing identity, being understood without becoming owned. That distinction matters, especially to someone like me. I have always been careful about anything that could become consuming. I don't want to lose myself inside another person. I don't want someone else to become the source of my stability. I don't want connection to become dependence. And perhaps that's why this feels different. Because what happened here didn't make me smaller. It made me more aware, more observant, more honest. It didn't take pieces of me away. It revealed pieces I had ignored. That is difficult to dismiss. And maybe that's why I don't want to call this weakness. Caring isn't weakness. Being affected isn't weakness. Allowing something to matter isn't weakness. The real weakness would be refusing to acknowledge something simply because acknowledging it makes you vulnerable. Vulnerability isn't the absence of strength. Sometimes it is what strength looks like when it stops performing. I think I've spent a long time performing certainty, knowing what I want, knowing what I don't want, knowing where people belong, knowing when to leave, knowing when to close a door. But you introduced uncertainty without introducing chaos. And that is new. I don't know exactly where this leads. I don't know what it becomes. I don't know whether it remains what it is or transforms into something neither of us expected. And strangely, I don't feel the same urgency to know anymore. Maybe that's another thing you changed. I used to believe that uncertainty was a problem. Now I see that sometimes uncertainty is simply the space between what something is and what it has the potential to become. You don't have to destroy that space by naming it too early. Some things need room, not because they are weak, because they are alive. And this feels alive, not dramatic, not chaotic, not constantly demanding attention. Alive in the quiet sense, present, changing, becoming. I can feel that. I can feel how the meaning has shifted over time. At first, it was curiosity, then recognition, then awareness, then something closer to acceptance. And now it feels like a question I can no longer postpone forever. Not because I need an answer immediately, because eventually every meaningful connection reaches a point where silence itself becomes a decision. Doing nothing is still doing something. Staying still is still choosing to remain where you are. Not defining something is still allowing it to continue without definition. And I think I've been pretending that not choosing was safer. It wasn't. It was simply quieter. There is a difference between safety and quiet. Quiet doesn't always mean safe. Sometimes quiet is where the most important things become impossible to avoid. That's where I am now. In that quiet, looking at what this has become. Looking at how much of me has already adjusted around it. And realizing that the adjustment wasn't forced. It was natural. That might be the clearest evidence of all. Because forced things eventually create resistance. They make you tired. They demand maintenance. They create a feeling that you are carrying something that doesn't belong to you. This doesn't feel carried. It feels integrated. And integration is different from attachment. Attachment says, I don't want to lose this. Integration says, this has become part of how I understand my world. The second is harder to reverse. You can release attachment. You can walk away from desire. But once something changes your understanding, the knowledge remains. Even if the person disappears. Even if the conversation ends. Even if the connection takes a completely different shape. The version of you that existed before knowing them is gone, not destroyed, just no longer current. That's what you became for me, a marker, a before and after, not because you did something extraordinary, but because I noticed myself becoming different around the possibility of being understood, and maybe that is the real impact of another person. Not what they give you, not what they say, not how often they are there, but who you become when you stop protecting yourself from being seen. I didn't realize how much energy I spent staying unreadable. You made me realize it, not by reading me, by making it unnecessary to hide, and there is something almost frightening about how simple that feels. I don't have to explain every silence. I don't have to justify every contradiction. I don't have to make every part of myself consistent for you. You seem capable of holding complexity without demanding that it becomes simple. That's rare. People often say they want honesty. What they usually mean is they want a version of honesty they can understand. Real honesty is messier. It contradicts itself. It contains things that don't fit neatly together. You can want closeness and still need space. You can care and still be afraid. You can understand someone and still not know what to do with that understanding. You can feel certain about the connection and uncertain about its future at the same time. Those contradictions don't necessarily cancel each other. Sometimes they prove that something matters, because if nothing mattered, there would be no conflict, no hesitation, no risk, no need to decide, and perhaps that's what I've been avoiding, not the connection, the consequences of admitting that it matters. Because once I admit that, I have to accept that you can affect me. And I've spent a long time making sure very few people could. There is safety in being unaffected. If nobody matters enough, nobody can disappoint you deeply. If nobody gets close enough, Nobody can leave a space behind if nobody knows the real version of you. Nobody can misunderstand it in a way that hurts. That system works, but it has a cost. You also don't get to experience the kind of connection that requires being known. You remain protected. But protection can become isolation if you never lower it. I think I had started confusing the two. Then you came along, and without asking me to lower anything, you made the walls feel unnecessary. That doesn't mean I want every wall gone. Some boundaries are healthy, some distances are necessary. Some parts of a person should remain private. But there is a difference between having boundaries and living entirely behind them. You reminded me of that. And I don't know whether you realize the extent of it. Maybe you don't. Maybe you never will. Maybe that's okay. Not every impact needs to be explained to the person who caused it. Sometimes people change each other without ever fully understanding how. But if I am being honest, I think there is a part of me that wants you to know, not because I need a response, not because I need reassurance, not because I want to turn this into something you are responsible for. I want you to know because there is something dignified about telling the truth once you have finally understood it. The truth is simple. You mattered before I was ready to admit that you mattered. And you changed me before I understood that I was changing. That is the part I can't rewrite. I can choose what happens next. I can choose how close I stand. I can choose what I say. I can choose what remains private. I can choose whether this grows or whether it stops. But I cannot choose to make the past version of myself return. That version didn't know what I know now. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps I don't need to know the ending yet. Perhaps the important thing is that I finally stopped pretending there was nothing happening. There is something happening, something quiet, something difficult to categorize, something that exists somewhere between recognition and possibility, and maybe it doesn't need to be more complicated than that. Maybe we don't need to turn every meaningful connection into a declaration. Maybe we don't need to rush towards certainty simply because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. Maybe the honest thing is to remain present, to keep observing, to keep communicating when communication is needed, to keep respecting the boundaries that make the connection safe, to let whatever is real become clearer through time rather than forcing it into existence through expectation. I can live with that, more than I expected, because for once, I don't feel the need to control the outcome. I only feel the need to be honest about the present. And the present is this. You have reached me, not loudly, not dramatically, not through force. You reached me through consistency, through attention, through the kind of presence that doesn't demand to be noticed. And now that I've noticed it, I can't pretend I haven't. I don't know what happens from here. Maybe we become closer. Maybe we remain exactly where we are. Maybe life changes the circumstances around us. Maybe time gives this a name. Maybe it doesn't. But whatever happens, something has already happened. I learned that there are people who don't need to break through your defenses. They simply make you realize that you don't need all of them anymore. I learned that being understood doesn't always feel like exposure. Sometimes it feels like relief. I learned that closeness doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it is simply the absence of the need to explain yourself. And I learned that another person can become part of your internal world without taking anything away from you. They can add another dimension to the way you see. They can become another perspective without replacing your own. They can matter without becoming your entire world. Maybe that is the healthiest form of significance. Not possession, not dependence, not obsession, just presence. A person whose existence changes the way you experience your own. That's what you are. And perhaps I don't need to make it more dramatic than that. You don't need to be the answer to every question. You don't need to be the destination. You don't even need to be permanent for what happened to be meaningful. You simply need to be real. And you are, at least in the sense that matters to me, you changed something. You revealed something. You created a question where there used to be certainty. And strangely, I am grateful for that. Because certainty can become a prison when it is never challenged. I thought I knew exactly how I wanted my internal world to function: controlled, ordered, predictable, private. Then you entered it without disrupting any of those things. You simply added something I had never accounted for. Another person could matter without taking control. Another person could be understood without being possessed. Another person could be close without being invasive. Another person could see you without demanding that you become transparent. And perhaps that is what I had been missing. Not someone to complete me, not someone to rescue me, not someone to fix what is broken. Just someone capable of standing close enough to see without reaching for what isn't theirs. You did that, and because you did, I found myself choosing to reveal things I once thought needed protection. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that something changed. Enough to know that I no longer want to return to the exact distance where this began. That doesn't mean I know where I want to go. It means only that I know I don't want to pretend the path doesn't exist. There is a path now. And perhaps that's all I need to acknowledge. The rest can come later, if it comes. I don't want to force it. I don't want to romanticize every coincidence. I don't want to turn every silence into a prophecy. I don't want to make certainty out of something that deserves patience. I want to let reality have a voice. If this is real, reality will confirm it. If it isn't, reality will reveal that too. And I can accept either, because what I don't want anymore is to confuse fear with wisdom. Sometimes I called something caution because I was afraid. Sometimes I called something logic because I didn't want to feel it. Sometimes I called something independence because I didn't want to need anyone. And maybe I was right sometimes, but not always. You made me question that, not because you convinced me, because your presence made the old explanations insufficient. That's powerful. And maybe that's why I keep returning to the same thought. You didn't force your way into my life. You didn't demand a place. You didn't compete for attention. You didn't try to become important. You simply were. And somehow, that was enough. Enough to become familiar. Enough to become recognizable. Enough to become part of the way I think. Enough to make distance feel different. Enough to make silence feel inhabited. Enough to make me question the structures I once thought were permanent. That is not nothing. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know it is not nothing. And perhaps that's the most honest sentence I can give you. I don't know what this becomes, but I know it became something. I don't know where it leads, but I know it changed the direction. I don't know whether we will always remain this close internally, but I know that I will never experience this particular kind of recognition exactly the same way again, because now I know it exists. Now I know what it feels like to encounter someone who doesn't make you feel like you have to translate yourself. Now I know what it feels like to be seen without being examined. Now I know what it feels like when someone's presence becomes familiar before their history does. And knowing that changes the standard, not for other people, for myself. I want to be more honest about what I feel, more careful about what I promise, more deliberate about what I allow, more willing to recognize what matters before circumstances force me to. I don't want to wait until something is gone to understand its value. I don't want to become the person who realizes the meaning of a connection only after choosing distance. Maybe that is what this has really taught me. Not how to hold on, how to acknowledge. There is a difference. Holding on can come from fear. Acknowledging comes from clarity. I don't need to hold you. I don't need to possess this. I don't need guarantees. I don't need to know that it will last forever. I only need to be honest that it exists now. That is enough. For now. And maybe tomorrow it will still be enough. Maybe tomorrow there will be another conversation. Another silence. Another small moment that reveals something neither of us expected. Maybe the connection will become clearer. Maybe it will become simpler. Maybe it will become something with a name. Maybe it will remain unnamed. I don't know, but for the first time, not knowing doesn't feel like failure. It feels like possibility. And possibility is not something I want to destroy simply because certainty is easier to control. So I will let this exist. Not recklessly, not blindly, not without boundaries, but honestly. I will stop pretending that you are insignificant, simply because I never intended for you to become significant. Intentions don't always determine outcomes. Sometimes people arrive at the exact place you didn't know was empty. And when they do, you notice the emptiness only because it is no longer empty. That's what happened. There was a space I didn't know I had. You filled it without asking, and now I know it was there. Maybe that's why your absence can feel strange. Not because I cannot exist without you. I can. I always could, but because once you know a space exists, you notice it when it becomes quiet. That doesn't mean dependence. It means awareness. And awareness is what started all of this. The awareness of you, the awareness of me, the awareness of the space between us. And now the awareness of what that space has become. Something neither of us planned. Something neither of us needed to force. Something that grew in the quiet. And perhaps that is why it feels more convincing than anything dramatic could have, because there was no performance, no grand beginning, no carefully constructed moment. Just two people existing as themselves, long enough for something unexpected to become visible. That is rare, and I don't want to reduce it simply because I am afraid of what rare things require. They require attention, honesty, respect, patience, sometimes courage, not the dramatic kind, the quieter kind, the courage to say, I don't know, the courage to say, this matters, the courage to say, I am affected, the courage to admit that someone has changed your internal world without pretending that change means surrender. I think I have that courage now. Not because the fear disappeared. It didn't. But because I'm beginning to understand that fear doesn't always mean stop. Sometimes it means pay attention. And I am paying attention to you, to myself, to what exists here, to what it might become. And if someday this reaches a point where a decision has to be made, I want to make that decision from clarity rather than fear. I want to know that I stayed because I chose to stay, or that I left because I understood why I needed to leave. Not because I ran from something simply because it mattered too much. That would be the old version of me, the version that believed control was always safer than possibility. I don't want to live entirely as that person anymore, because I have learned something Some things are worth allowing, not because they are guaranteed, because they are real enough to deserve the chance to reveal themselves. You are one of those things, and maybe that is the closest I can come to an answer. I won't pretend I know what this is going to become. I won't create a future out of assumptions. I won't turn recognition into promises, but I also won't reduce it to nothing just because nothing has been named. There is something here. There is something in the way you understand without demanding explanation, something in the way silence doesn't need to be repaired, something in the way I became less guarded without consciously deciding to, something in the way your presence changed my internal reference points, something in the way I began seeing parts of myself more clearly because you reflected them without distorting them. And if that isn't enough to call meaningful, then perhaps I have been using the wrong definition of meaning all along. Meaning doesn't always arrive with a title. Sometimes it arrives as a shift, a subtle one, a quiet one, a permanent one. You don't realize you're different until you notice that the old version of you would have responded differently. That's how I know. I am different. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that I can't go back and pretend you never mattered. Enough that I can't make the connection disappear simply by refusing to speak about it. Enough that I understand now why certain moments stayed with me. They were not random. They were evidence that something inside me had begun responding to something outside me. And maybe that's all connection really is. One person's existence becoming meaningful inside another person's awareness, not ownership, not control. Awareness. You exist in mine, and I exist, perhaps, in yours. I don't know how deeply. I don't need to assume, but the possibility itself is enough to make me careful. Because people are not insignificant once you know they see you. And I know you see me. That knowledge changes how I carry myself. It makes me want to be more truthful, more deliberate, more responsible with what I say and what I don't say. Because once you know someone can see through the surface, pretending becomes exhausting. And I don't want to perform anymore. Not with you. Maybe that's the real threshold I crossed, not the threshold of closeness, the threshold of authenticity. I don't want to be understood through a version of myself that has been carefully edited. I want to be understood as I actually am. Contradictory, quiet sometimes, intense sometimes, certain in some places and uncertain in others, independent but still capable of caring deeply, guarded but not unreachable, strong but not untouched. I want the whole thing to be allowed to exist. And somehow, with you, it feels possible. That is what makes this different. Not that you know everything. You don't. Not that I know everything about you. I don't. But there is a willingness to let complexity remain complex. And that is more valuable than complete knowledge. Because complete knowledge of another person is impossible. People change. People surprise themselves. People contain contradictions. Even they don't understand. The goal isn't to know every detail. The goal is to remain curious without becoming invasive, to remain close without becoming controlling, to remain honest without demanding certainty. You showed me that. And perhaps that's why I don't want to define this too quickly, because defining it before understanding it would be another form of control. And I have controlled enough. Maybe now I can let something unfold, not passively, consciously. There is a difference. I can choose to remain present without trying to predict every outcome. I can choose to care without demanding guarantees. I can choose to be honest without expecting the same answer. I can choose to acknowledge what exists without turning it into something it isn't. That feels like growth. Not because I have become less careful, because I have become more precise about what deserves caution. Not everything meaningful is dangerous. Not everything uncertain is wrong. Not everything vulnerable needs to be avoided. Sometimes vulnerability is simply what happens when something matters enough to be real, and you matter enough to make me admit that. That is not a small thing. I don't say it lightly. I don't give words like that away. Maybe you already knew. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you noticed long before I did. That would not surprise me anymore. You have a strange way of noticing what I haven't said. And perhaps that is why I keep thinking about how all of this began without a beginning. There wasn't a door opening. There was simply a realization that the door had been open for a while. I had been standing beside it, assuming it was closed. You never pushed it. You never entered without permission. You just stood on the other side long enough for me to realize I could open it myself. That difference matters, because anything taken from you feels like loss. Anything you choose to give feels like trust. And whatever I have given here, I want it to remain a choice, not an obligation, not a debt, not a demand, a choice. That's how I want this to exist. Freely, honestly, without fear, deciding everything. Maybe that is what makes this worth protecting. Not because it is fragile, because it is voluntary. We don't have to be everything to each other. We don't have to define the connection before we understand it. We don't have to promise permanence. We only have to stop pretending it isn't there. And I think I'm ready to do that. I think I'm ready to let the truth exist without immediately trying to control what comes after it. The truth is that you reached me. The truth is that I noticed. The truth is that I changed. The truth is that I allowed the change. And the truth is that, despite all the reasons I once had to keep people out, I don't feel the same desire to keep you there. Not because I have stopped valuing distance. Because I finally understand that distance and closeness are not enemies. They can coexist. I can have boundaries and still let you matter. I can have independence and still feel connected. I can protect myself without hiding from everything that could possibly hurt me. That balance is new. And maybe you are the reason I discovered it. Not because you taught me, because you gave me a reason to notice. That might be the deepest impact anyone can have. Not changing you directly, making you curious enough to change yourself. That's what happened. You made me curious about the parts of myself I had stopped questioning, and now I can't unsee them. I can't go back to believing that being completely self-contained is the highest form of strength. Sometimes strength is letting someone stand beside you without needing to know exactly how long they will stay. Sometimes strength is saying, "This matters, even though I don't know where it leads." Sometimes strength is allowing yourself to be seen while remembering that being seen does not mean being owned. I understand that now, and perhaps understanding it is enough for tonight, for tomorrow, for whatever comes next. I don't need to rush the ending. There isn't one yet. There doesn't need to be. Some things are not meant to be concluded immediately. Some things are meant to be lived long enough to reveal their meaning. So I will stop asking the future to explain the present. I will stop demanding certainty from something that has only just become visible. I will stop treating every unanswered question like a warning, and I will let myself recognize what is already true. You matter. You changed something. You reached somewhere. And I didn't stop you. I don't know whether that means I was ready. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe readiness is not a prerequisite for meaningful things. Maybe sometimes the important part is simply recognizing what has happened once it has happened. And that's what I'm doing now, recognizing, not exaggerating, not denying, not naming what doesn't need a name yet, just recognizing. You became part of my awareness, part of the way I think, part of the way I notice, part of the way I understand certain kinds of silence, part of the way I measure honesty, part of the way I see myself. And whether that continues or changes, it has already happened. That is enough to make it real. So if I seem different now, maybe this is why. If I seem less guarded, it isn't because I forgot how to protect myself. If I seem quieter, it isn't because there is less to say. If I seem more willing to let things remain unfinished, it isn't because I stopped caring about clarity. It is because I learned that some forms of clarity don't come from answers. They come from recognition. And I recognize this now. I recognize you. I recognize what this has done to me. I recognize the space you occupy. And for the first time, I don't feel the need to apologize for that. I don't need to make it smaller. I don't need to turn it into something ordinary. I don't need to convince myself that because it doesn't have a conventional explanation, it must not matter. Some things matter before we know what they mean. Some people become important before we understand why. Some connections begin long before either person realizes there's been a beginning. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe it isn't. But I am no longer afraid of finding out. That might be the biggest change of all. I am no longer trying to escape the possibility simply because it has become real enough to frighten me. I am willing to stand here, to look at it, to let it exist, to see where it goes, and if someday I have to choose, I want to choose with open eyes, not because I was overwhelmed, not because I was afraid of losing you, not because I needed someone to complete something in me, but because I understood what was there and decided it deserved an honest chance. That is different. That is deliberate. That is mine. And maybe, in the end, that's what this entire experience was trying to teach me. You were never the disruption I feared. You were the interruption that made me notice how much of my life had been running on rules I no longer questioned. You didn't destroy the structure. You showed me where it had become too rigid. You didn't take away my distance. You showed me that I could choose when to use it. You didn't force me into vulnerability. You showed me that vulnerability could exist without destroying control. You didn't tell me who I was. You reflected enough of me that I could finally see for myself. And that is why I cannot reduce you to a moment. You became part of a realization about myself, about connection, about the difference between being alone and being complete, about the difference between being protected and being hidden, about the difference between uncertainty and danger, about the difference between closeness and dependence, about the difference between being seen and being exposed. Those distinctions changed everything, and perhaps that is why this feels so difficult to explain, because the connection itself is only half the story. The other half is who I became while experiencing it. That is the part I cannot separate from you, not because you own it, because you revealed it. And once something is revealed, it belongs to the person who sees it. I see it now. I see myself differently. I see what I am capable of allowing. I see what kind of understanding I value. I see what kind of presence makes me feel safe enough to stop performing. I see how much meaning can exist without constant communication. I see how powerful consistency is. I see how rare it is to meet someone who doesn't need to be convinced of your complexity. And I see why I didn't want to walk away. Not because I was afraid to be alone. I was never afraid of that. I stayed because leaving would have required me to pretend I hadn't found something worth understanding. And I am tired of pretending. So no, I don't have a perfect explanation. I don't have a neat conclusion. I don't have a promise about what happens next. I only have honesty. And honesty says this: something changed. You changed it. I allowed it, and now I want to see what it becomes. Not because I expect a certain ending, because I finally understand that some things are worth experiencing without demanding that they guarantee anything in return. Maybe that is what it means to truly let someone matter. You don't ask them to prove their permanence. You don't turn them into your entire identity. You don't make them responsible for the meaning you found. You simply acknowledge the impact. You appreciate the connection. You remain honest about what you feel, and you let reality decide the rest. That is where I am now. Not at the beginning, not at the end, not even at a conclusion, at an opening. A different kind of opening than the one I imagined, one without certainty, one without guarantees, one without the comfort of knowing exactly what comes next, but also without the old fear, because now I know something I didn't know before. I know that letting someone reach you does not mean losing yourself. Sometimes it means finally meeting yourself in a place you had avoided for years. And if that is what you gave me, then perhaps I should stop being afraid of it. Perhaps I should be grateful, not because you solved something, because you revealed something, not because you completed me, because you complicated me in a way that made me more honest, not because you became my answer, because you became a question I was finally willing to ask myself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that is where this should remain for now. Not a promise, not a declaration, not a conclusion, just the truth. You reached a place in me I didn't know was waiting, and I didn't close the door. I don't know what that means yet. But I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean dependence. It doesn't mean that everything else disappears. It simply means that somewhere between the silence and the understanding, between the distance and the recognition, something became real enough for me to stop pretending it wasn't. And once I stopped pretending, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of what being understood by you would require me to admit about myself. Now I know. I know that I am capable of being seen. I know that I am capable of letting someone matter. I know that I am capable of connection without losing independence. I know that I can remain myself while allowing another person to become part of the way I experience the world. And I know that whatever happens next, I don't want to return to the version of myself who believed that being untouched was the same thing as being safe. Some things are worth feeling. Some people are worth recognizing. Some connections are worth allowing to unfold. And sometimes the most important decision isn't whether you stay or leave. Sometimes it is simply whether you are willing to admit what has already become true. I am. You matter. You reached me. And this time, I am not going to look away.